with my dad, Bill Strohman. Thank you for meeting with us today. Just tell us a little bit about yourself.
Well, I'm Abby's dad, and I'm a dentist in north central Iowa. It's a town called Algona. It's about 6,000 people, a relatively large practice. We have 8 employees. We're about ready to hire our ninth. And Abby actually has worked in my office as a dental assistant. And I went to the University of Iowa. I entered dental school after 3 years and got my undergraduate degree, my bachelor's degree after the first year of dental school. Then graduated from dental school in 1985. Graduated from Algona High School. I grew up in this town. My dad practiced dentistry in this town for many, many years. I was born in Iowa City when my dad was in graduate school in pediatric dentistry in 1959. And anything else?
No, that's good. We're just going to talk a little bit about our family history and just get some information from you. Is there any, what's the oldest family member that you can recall?
Okay, well,
as far back
I
as you can
recall my
remember.
grandparents. On my father's side, my grandfather on my father's side died at a very young age before I was born. When my dad was just in college, or actually maybe in high school. Okay, I really can't remember which. But then I knew my grandmother on his side. Her name was Olive. Was interesting that she had one of these antique pump organs that she played with these knobs, and it made these strange sounds. And that's still in my dad's office in the basement. And then I knew my mother's parents very well. I spent my summers growing up in Clarion, Iowa, which is about 50, 60 miles from Algona in north central Iowa. And my grandfather had a relatively colored career. He had a lot of interesting things. He was sheriff. He was a major league baseball player, minor league baseball player, school teacher. There were a number of things. Actually, mayor of Clarion for a number of years. He was mayor of Clarion when I knew him. I spent my summers in Clarion being educated, or basically re-educated, by my grandmother, who was a fourth grade school teacher. My mother, Abby's grandmother, Lois, was very academic, okay, very motivated academically, and she wanted me to excel in school. So I spent my summers, 3 months, for 2, 3, maybe even 4 summers, I just don't recall. It was in the late 60s, being educated by my grandmother. And I just remember we'd have a whole curriculum, and I'd spend the summer going to school, as well as going in the winter. But it was a fun summer, and I spent a lot of time at the police station, because my grandfather, again, was mayor, and which is a fun childhood in Clarion, Iowa. So I got to know Clarion, got to know a lot of people in Clarion, got to know the people in the police force, got to know a lot of people in government, and spent a lot of really fun times in a restaurant called the New Home Cafe in Clarion, Iowa, with my grandmother eating pie. So
Sounds like a good summer.
it was a great summer.
So are your grandparents the farthest back you can recall, just in terms of names, even if you know just the names?
Yeah, historically, that's as far back as our family goes. I mean, my grandparents, both of those two, died in 1969 when I must have been 10 years old at that time. And it was kind of a tragic thing. A late life changer for my parents. It affected them spiritually in a lot of ways, and probably led me to where I am because of that event in 1969, in December of 1969, when they both died. And I could get in a little dissertation about that. I don't know if it's fundamentally germane to our conversation, but as a result of that, my parents got very motivated spiritually and ended up going to some Billy Graham crusades. I went to a Billy Graham crusade in 1972, okay, and committed my life to Christ. But my folks had made a commitment to Christ sometime prior to that, maybe a year earlier. But it was a real tragic event for my mother to lose both of her parents suddenly in 1969. And it affected me because I was really close to those two.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, understandable. Do you know, the principal area that our family settled prior to 1922?
Well, my grandfather was born in Foster, Iowa, okay, according to Wikipedia. Yeah, I got a little help from them. But, and basically in Monroe County in Iowa is where he was from. and but they settled and spent their time in Clarion. My father's side was in Webster County, Iowa, which is more southern Iowa. And actually, our family still owns 30 acres of farmland, which is minuscule by any farming standpoint, but we still have original family farm of 30 acres, which is in my dad and my name. And will eventually be in your name, Abby. Okay? So.
Do you have any interesting family history in particular that you would like to share?
Probably the most interesting was my grandfather, who had a pretty colorful career as sheriff of Wright County. But most interesting was his baseball career, which started out in the minors. He originally in the early 20s, after the Black Sox event in 1919, and then the subsequent trial in 1921. He was signed a minor league semi-pro contract. That was a pro contract with a baseball firm in Spencer, Iowa. And then he got sent to a team called the Lincoln Lynx, okay? There was a family called the Clark family, I believe it is, that owned, I have all sorts of information in front of me. We have all the contracts, actually. But he was sent to the Lincoln Lynx to play baseball. It was a kind of a Class A baseball league. Spent some time there, got sent down to San Antonio and signed a contract there. Wasn't getting paid a lot doing this, $250 I think at the Lynx, and maybe $300 for San Antonio for the entire summer, $300, okay? But prior to that is probably improvement. When he was 19, he was born. Let me just tell you when he was born. He was born in 1896. Based on today's date, which isn't going to be real relevant with the video, but he's almost exactly 120 years old. He's been deceased, obviously, for some time. I mentioned that. But let's go back. He was in San Antonio, and then he ended up being brought up to the majors. And we have all of his contracts from all of these minor league ball clubs, and they're all kind of interesting with all sorts of, people wrote back then differently than they do now. I mean, they were obviously involved in negotiation, and my grandfather obviously wanted more money, and we've got all the back and forth. But that in and of itself is somewhat interesting because it's somewhat time specific in the negotiation. But he had this dissertation with Charles Comiskey, which I found somewhat interesting because Charles Comiskey in and of himself had a pretty colorful career for the Chicago White Sox. Well, he was recruited by Charles Comiskey under a set of unique circumstances. I could go into those. He decided to quit minor league ball, go back into selling groceries, and we have all these newspaper articles that I've texted to Abby and sent to Abby via email describing him leaving his grocery business, which was described, I'm being a little redundant here, as the most successful grocery business in Clarion, Iowa, and he made potentially, I think it was said, in 6 months playing for the White Sox, more than he would make in 3 years in the grocery business, which was considered a high-paid deal. He was making $3,200 playing for the White Sox. I just converted that to $2,016. He was making $43,000 a year playing for the White Sox, which, I don't know, by today's standard doesn't sound like a lot of income, but it was a different time. And you didn't get rich instantly playing professional sports in 1928. And that's the year we're talking about. He was, so we signed these contracts with Charles Comiskey. And I say George, Charles Comiskey in 1928. And we have all these documents. We have these correspondences with Charles Comiskey, several of them. We have the telegram that he received when he was in San Antonio, before he went to San Antonio for the year in 1927, December. He got this telegram from San Antonio. He said, "Don't report to us. Go to Chicago." And we have a number of large photographs of him getting on a train for spring training with Chicago White Sox in this old steam locomotive, and he was going to the Chicago Northwestern or some railroad. I think it was Chicago and Alton or something, but I have it all written down. But it was pretty interesting. He did really, really well in spring training in 1928, but he played only one game. One game against the Indians. Cleveland Indians. They lost 7-2, I believe. And the opener in 1928, he got in a fight with Charles Comiskey. At least this is what the family's saying. I don't have any documentation about this, over how much he was having to play, and he claimed he was playing too much. That seems disputable to me, that he was playing too much since he had played one game. But that's beside the point. He played 3 innings in one game. It's all documented. He is officially a player who actually played in the major leagues, but only 3 innings. And then he got a fight with Charles Comiskey. And I believe my dad and Charles Comiskey had 2 things very much in common. My grandfather, not my dad, my grandfather, Charles Comiskey, had 2 things in common. They both could get angry very easily. And the combination of those 2 individuals probably didn't work too good. My grandfather went back, I believe, to his grocery business, then eventually became sheriff of Wright County, had a number of very interesting incidences, some unfortunate ones. He actually had to shoot a man, there's all sorts of newspaper articles regarding that. And political correctness didn't exist in the newspaper industry in the 30s, okay? He was involved in some of the early prohibition issues in the, I think, early 30s and late 20s, but he had a very, very interesting career, and went to FBI Academy. We got some letters from J. Edgar Hoover in here. He lost a son in World War II. He was a flight instructor in Pensacola and died when a bomber crashed. The airplane was a bomber, and that was an unfortunate thing. We got letters from an individual that wouldn't be known to your professor, but Virgil Hancher. Virgil Hancher, a very prominent past president of the University of Iowa. And we've got letters by H.R. Gross, which is a prominent governor in the state of Iowa. Got a lot of letters and correspondence he's had. Mentioned J. Edgar Hoover here, but I mean, number interesting correspondences, historical, time-specific, time capsule type correspondence. Here's one interesting letter from the Baseball Players Association of that time. It was their trade organization, I guess you call it, and they were trying to encourage him to rejoin because he apparently quit, and they were saying they gave money they help do a lot of good things rather than just negotiate with owners, and they gave money to some guy named Bill Bailey, who was a baseball player. I went and looked up Bill Bailey. He died in 1926. The letter was dated 1926, and so apparently this Bill Bailey, a professional baseball player, was down on his luck. He died that year, and then the Players Association gave money to him. And it's mentioned in this little typewritten letter that they gave money to Bill Bailey, which I thought was kind of interesting. So what I did is I newspaper clippings and then come back and then look on the history, and wow, this is really somewhat confirmed by internet search.
That's interesting.
Sorry, I took too much time there.
No, that's okay. So basically, Roy Wilson, my great-great-grandfather, he did basically everything. Is that what I'm hearing? He was a police
he did a lot of
officer,
things.
he was a teacher, he was a...
He started out as a school teacher, what I thought was kind of interesting. One thing really interesting is, and without taking the time to go find this, and you can I think I sent it to you, his teacher certificate dated 1915. Okay, he would be 19 years old at that time. Has on the certificate the scores he made on a test to get the certificate. So all the scores are listed in each category and how he did, and he averaged 70-some%. So he was legally a school teacher. I don't believe, I'm confident, you didn't have to go to college. You had to take an examination to be a school teacher at that time in history. And so he taught school apparently for some time, that went into minor league baseball, and then wasn't satisfied with his income with them. Left, started a grocery store, which was apparently very successful. Then came back and played for the White Sox one season.
One season.
Yeah.
How old was he when he was a school teacher, since it was like one of his first jobs?
19. Yeah, he was 19 years old when he was teaching school, and he probably had an occupation before that. There's a lot of interesting things that are said about him in here. It's really, one thing, when he had this unfortunate incident where he had to actually, when he was serving as sheriff, he had to actually shoot somebody. The guy was coming at a pickaxe after a family, and yeah, the individual was actually a significant veteran. He had been in multiple Asian conflicts during World War. Wow, I don't know. It must have been two, but it probably wasn't. Probably World War One. I don't know where he was, but I've got a list of his conflicts, and I'm really not sure the date of the incident. I'd have to look it up. But he saved this. He shot this guy because he was about to kill this family, and as part of the argument, they of course had a big, inquiry on whether he should have shot this guy or not. And the articles say that Roy Wilson would never protect himself as a police officer, but he would protect someone else. If he was being attacked, he would never shoot the man. He would always take his gun off and take his badge off and fight him bare hands. In the article, it was really kind of interesting.
In the newspaper.
And there were some horribly politically incorrect statements regarding the individual's nationality I don't want to get into on a video, but there were a lot of, I'll tell you one thing I thought interesting about these old articles is the political incorrectness. There were statements made about individuals acting like a certain nationality and certain stereotypes, and the authors would have no problem doing it. Another thing is, some of the articles, the Chicago articles regarding the baseball, they were written with such sophistication that literally most individuals nowadays would require a dictionary to know what half the words were because they were written so well. And so I thought that was kind of interesting. I mean, it was an education in how our society has changed, from a vocabulary standpoint, if nothing else.
Mm-hmm. That is really interesting. Good point to make. So now talk a little bit about you and what it was like when you were growing up. Just the difference in culture, for instance, like cell phones.
I was born in 1959. I grew up. I don't remember JFK getting shot. If I did, I probably only remember because I saw a video of it over and over again. I do remember Robert Kennedy being shot while he was running for president. That was relevant. I remember the Nixon thing completely. I was 11, 12 years old, and that was so relevant, the Watergate issues. Mm-hmm. I grew up kind of during a tough time. It was the 60s, and a lot of the hippie stuff was going on. A lot of that. I think out of all that, my grandparents dying in 69, I was 10 years old at that time. My parents making a commitment to the Lord. I making a commitment to the Lord at a Billy Graham crusade in Minneapolis in 1972. We were involved in a big ministry in Algona. Our family basically started it. It was called Time to Run. It was a movie that was going around the country. It was a Billy Graham movie. Worldwide Pictures put it on, and we showed that movie 17 times, I believe, in Algona. I think it was 14 to 17, something like that. And there was an altar call every time. I worked at every one of those movies, or virtually most of them, and that was really a game changer for me. I saw the movie way too much, but it was a really opportunity to minister the gospel in our community and then take a stand in our small Catholic community for Jesus Christ. And so it was a blessing in that respect, and really firmed up my faith in Christ. And then, of course, then there were people that were somewhat opposed to that. But anytime you take a stand, you're going to have opposition. So,
of course. What was it like growing up in a time with, like, my generation, for instance, would have no idea what it would be like growing up in a time without cell phones and computers?
I've talked to patients of mine, and it's really interesting. You get in your car and you drive somewhere an hour away, you had no communication with that person while you were driving, and then you had to pull up to a payphone if you needed to make a phone call. So communication wasn't something you did just casually. It was intentional, and it would actually cost money if you were on the road making a phone call. Not that it was expensive, but it'd be logistically somewhat of a hassle to have communication. So one thing your generation has that we didn't have, you guys communicated far more regularly than we do. We didn't communicate as much. All right. And so there was more of a sense of isolation than your age group experiences. I don't think that was for our benefit. I think that was for our detriment. But it was our time. We didn't even have laptop computers or small computers. I remember when I went to the University of Iowa in 1978. Okay, first year there was a computer major down the hall from me. He also liked bluegrass music, which kind of I thought was interesting. And I actually developed an interest in bluegrass music as a result of him because he was a highly intellectual guy.
Speaking of technology and how great it is, it still does make mistakes sometimes. So just continuing where we left off on talking about computers or lack of when you were growing up.
In 1978, when I went to the University of Iowa, there were no home computers, no laptops. There were absolutely no cell phones. I had an individual, his name was Kevin Sanders, doesn't really particularly matter, highly intellectual individual on my dorm floor about 2 doors down. Also, he liked bluegrass music. I don't know if I mentioned that, but he was a really intellectual guy, and I developed an interest in bluegrass music as a result of him because I just changed my whole mentality towards it. But he was a computer scientist, okay? He was studying computer science, and I knew very little about it, but he was speaking, doing computer languages and all sorts of things, Fortran and a bunch of old computer languages, and they were all dealing with computers the size of this room, okay? They were gigantic computers, and so computing at that time was not down to a size that anybody ever, could use themselves individually. It wasn't until my brother John was in law school that he had one of these first Apples that had this big floppy drive. It was kind of funky, but it was a different time. I mean, when you went to write a paper, when I was an undergraduate, okay, we didn't write papers much in dental school, but in undergraduate we wrote papers. We had to type them all out on a typewriter, electric typewriter. That was high tech. It's supposed to be manual, okay? But we typed them all out. I always hired someone to type them out because I was a terrible typist, even though my mother was a typing teacher. Okay, but it was a different time. Everything I can tell you was harder. Okay, you had to work harder to do things. I mean, I don't mean that saying anything negative about you guys, but you performed the document, but there was no spell check. You misspelled the word, you misspelled the word. If it's typed poorly, that was the guy you hired, or the typing job you did. It was time consuming, labor intensive, and probably the most profound difference is this communication issue with telephones. It is so convenient and such a blessing to be able to communicate readily, texting, verbally. It's just really a blessing. Changes a lot.
It's interesting because I know a lot of people now have been thinking back about how we have so much communication, but at the same time we limit so much of it because of the fact that people are always on their phones. So it's an interesting thing to think about how we can communicate more, but at the same time our interactions with others is sometimes not as genuine as it used to be. Would you agree with that statement or would you disagree?
That is a common held position that the cell phones have been fundamentally detrimental to our social interactions. And in some ways, on a person-to-person sense, it probably has been adverse. But we really do interact with more people, okay? We even products like Facebook, which, has been around a while, allows us into other people's lives and I think there's a lot good about that.
Mm-hmm.
There is negative. I mean, nothing more distressing to see than see a family around at a restaurant around the table and everybody's looking at their phone, or or when I was going to Iowa City to a Hawkeye football game, watching some girl texting while going down the highway 75 miles an hour, bumper to bumper. It's like,
Oh my
wow,
goodness.
I just got a text from one of my employees literally an hour ago. She was really excited. She was listening to a Christian radio station, and it was Emily, which is kind of exciting. And she was texting me while she was driving that she was listening to this Christian radio station, which is really great, but she has a reasonable chance of being killed while she's texting me. So, I think there's good and bad, and the good is underplayed. I think it's exceptional, but the bad is also really negative too. Some of the social interactions as a result of texting, people become somewhat inverted. I mean, that's not the right word.
Introverted.
Introverted. Excuse me. Thanks, Abby. Introverted, but then at the same time very outgoing. It's I don't. I'm not a psychologist. I can't even begin to fathom the
Mm-hmm.
differences, but there have been significant differences. We are a different people now than we were 20 or 30 years ago. We really are.
That's interesting. It's good to hear different perspectives on that issue because I know that's a big one people talk about anymore. But just to switch gears a little bit, were you involved? You had said you were involved in the Billy Graham movement. Where did you go to that? How did you get involved?
Went to Minneapolis. Minneapolis. I think we were involved in Billy Graham movement in several senses. Okay, they had this Time to Run movie the evangelical movie they were going through the whole country with by Worldwide Pictures, and our family was the chief for the head people involved in that in this community. So we got involved in a lot of other churches and brought everybody together and did a lot with that. But from a crusade standpoint, we went to the Minneapolis Crusade, which has been documented historically as a pretty relevant crusade, and I would believe it was 1972. It was 1972. I'm confident of that. And we were at that crusade. I walked forward. I think I'd made a commitment to Christ prior to that. I'm confident I did. But it was a real exciting time. There was the Jesus movement. People were really on fire for the Lord. There was a change in mentality. A lot of the sin aspect of the 60s, the Woodstock, some of the rebellion, there was some reaction to that. And really part of that, though, was the Calvary Chapel people. There was a lot of part of the rebellion against society and culture actually brought on some of the Jesus movement too. I think a significant part of it where, they're kind of tune in, tune out, but don't be a drug addict. Let's not be worldly. Let's be committed to Christ. And there was a lot of that. And so the Jesus movement wasn't just a reaction against sin. It was also a reaction against society in general. And it was an interesting time. I mean, I remember some of the early Christian music. First I listened to Andre Crouch when I was in high school and the Disciples. But then when I got to the University of Iowa, I was listening to Larry Norman. He had long blonde hair. That was unheard of back then. Christians all had short butches and wore really nice clothes to church. That was crazy. But I liked Randy Stonehill, Larry Norman, Phil Keaggy, a guy named Paul Clark back then. That was early Christian music. Randy Stonehill, I mentioned him. I mean, it was an interesting time and exciting time to be a believer. But there was a lot, I went to the University of Iowa. It was very secular, very anti-Christian. We were pretty proactive. We did a lot of campus ministries. My brother John and I, he preached on campus. We did a lot of things to minister the gospel. I had Jesus stuff all over the door of my dorm room my freshman and sophomore year, and it was a unique time.
Yeah, that's interesting. Could you explain a little bit or just give us details about what it was like being at one of those crusades for Billy Graham?
Well, they were large arena type events, okay, and you can watch the videos of them. It's pretty good representation. He would have George Beverly Shea, which was his big vocalist, which is kind of a old school type singing, or somebody else. He'd have somebody hip. Billy Graham was very attuned to. I think his primary interest was, ministering the gospel, irrespective of culture, and so he would have some singer, some famous singer, and then he would have Pat Boone, I think, spoke at a few of them, but I don't know who was up in Minneapolis in 1972. But and then he'd preach, and he'd preach the gospel, simple, It was pretty basic. There were segments of Christianity that didn't like Billy Graham, and I even attended churches that he wasn't, he's heretical. He involved himself with a lot of sitting presidents and significant people, and that offended some people because those individuals may not have been living very godly lives, and there was a sense he was condoning those. I don't think that's true. I think he had a very effective ministry, reached a lot of people for Jesus Christ. My parents, my mother, who's deceased, went to her grave, committed to Christ, did a lot of ministry. Still have her Bibles where she handed out these little Bibles that underlined relevant scripture on how to be saved. Abby knows this, and then you know this, and then my father. They both came to Christ because of the Billy Graham ministry. I think it had a major impact on them, and it had a major impact on me. And I think you can pick any ministry and find things wrong with it, as long as they're not so fundamentally theological that they're heretical. I think God uses a lot of different things. Don't want to get too theoretical,
you're doing great.
Theological, but
Yeah, no, that's really great. It's cool to see how that movement affected you and your family, especially our family.
It absolutely did. It affected our family, and then it affected you and Josh. All right, and so it impacted. It's a generational thing. Christianity, is one generation away from extinction. I hear that statement. I'm not sure that's true, because the Holy Spirit is what convicts you and saves you.
Another little technology issue. Is there anything else, since you got cut off again, about Billy Graham movement that you'd like to continue to talk about?
Well, I think just that Billy Graham, that ministry had significant efficacy in a lot of people's lives. Yeah, there are a lot of people that didn't stay committed. Jesus said that would happen, that some of my seed will be laid on, rocky soil. It'll grow up and be enthusiastic, and then not mature. But I want to tell you, some of it hit good soil, and for that I'm grateful. I'm grateful to God, grateful to the Holy Spirit, and so there's a lot of good, maybe some bad, but a lot of good.
I just really find it cool how it impacted our family so specifically and has trickled down to my generation. Growing up in a Christian home largely because of a big movement that was going on during that time. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. That's good.
Thank you for talking with me today, despite some of the technological difficulties.
That's all right. We are a long